This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
How are we going? Hello. All right, we'll just give everyone a few more minutes.
I think in our timetables, this tutorial starts at 7:15. So will it be 7 or 7:15 going forward?
I thought 7 might work for everybody.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good.
And we can even change that time for next week if that suits. So I'll get everybody's opinion on that. All right, it's 7 o'clock. We might start. Welcome, everyone. My name's Gino Mitrioni. I suppose the first question is, how have we gone trying to find tonight's PowerPoint presentation and the subject reader? Has anyone actually found and downloaded that? Anybody? So you can use your chat function on Zoom just to give me an idea. Okay. All right. Apologies for that. I'll certainly, I don't know why the library's empty. I'm just getting a note here that the library's empty. I've put it where you've got, someone's had a problem with the video. I'm not sure why. How many have viewed the video without any problems? Yeah, the lecture. Okay. All right, so the video might be working okay. Well, that's good. The lecture recording, rather. So I will stay online tonight and make sure that you all have access to the PowerPoint presentation and the subject reader. All right, so in light of that, I might flick through the PowerPoint presentation. I mean, you've seen that as part of the. So can everybody see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
All right, I might just flick through it quickly and just give you a snapshot of what I spoke or covered. So they're just contact details for me. Anytime you can ring me anytime or email me either at work or at Melbourne Uni. So either of those. So there is an overview of what we're going to be covering this semester. So the 12-week breakdown. I've included 3 assignments. We might have to discuss the first assignment, seeing as some of you are having problems, or all of you are having problems downloading the lecture material. We can discuss maybe changing those due dates, but we'll see how we go. And so the score this year on this subject will be made up of 15% assignment 1, 25% assignment 2, 30% assignment 3, and then the final exam 30%. In the past, we've also had a bit of a mock court case situation where I get students to be expert witnesses and they're cross-examined in some of the evidence. I just figured that was going to be difficult to do without being in the classroom this year, but we might see if I can do something in relation to that. So I'll leave that as a possibility. So I spoke generally about what statutory valuations as a subject is about, and basically it's government valuations. Wherever governments are involved in the valuation process, we're going to cover the majority of that, certainly in Australia, under this subject. So this subject is split into 2 parts. One is valuations for rating and taxation purposes. Council rates, land tax, stamp duty, GST, capital gains tax, fire services, property levy. We're going to cover those and how they work. And the second half of the year will be on compensation valuation. So governments in Australia, all levels of government, we have 3 levels. All governments in Australia have the authority to compulsorily take property for various projects, roads, schools, hospitals, bridges, all those sorts of things. So we'll be covering the process that includes compulsory taking property and also paying, which is more important, paying fair and reasonable compensation for taking of that. And if anyone's got any questions as we go, please just put your hand up on the board and ask your questions. So as far as property-based taxes are concerned, we're going to be looking at council rates, as I said, land tax, fire services, property levy, stamp duty, goods and services tax, capital gains, and there's a breakdown there of which level of government is responsible for them, local, state, and federal. Compensation, quite complex. This whole subject is actually quite complex. So it's important for you to really pay attention to the principles that I cover each week, because they're very complex and very difficult to understand, but you need to make sure, you need to tell me if you're struggling to understand them, because the following week we just get into more and more theory, practices and definitions. So it's important for you to have a good handle on the material that we cover. And if we have to extend some of the classes, I'm happy to do that, to have classes. I know it's difficult on an online basis, but if you require some additional tutorials, I can certainly set them up, no worries. That's one of the good things of being locked down, gives us a bit extra time. So if we want to do some extra classes, we're all at home, I suppose, here's an opportunity for us to do that. So let me know if you need that as we move forward. I spoke about an example of a compulsory acquisition. This is a property that I've been involved in. Vic Roads acquired all of that land in the purple dotted area for major roads. And this is a classic example of a partial acquisition where part of the land remains is this part here, and this triangular part here. They remained in the ownership, but the Vic Roads has acquired that and this portion. So what is the assessment process that we go through to determine what the fair and reasonable compensation payable for the dispossessed owner and anybody who has an interest in the property should be paid. So just as a breakdown, this week will be devoted to, just as an overview and introduction. Rating valuations will be covered in weeks 2 to 5. We'll be looking at other property related taxes, GST and other taxes, and especially land tax. And land tax itself is quite a complex system and process, so we'll devote some time to that. Compensation valuations between weeks 7 and 10, court overview, VCAT and courts. We'll be looking at that, because anytime we have governments involved in valuation processes, there's always litigation, or there's always a strong chance of litigation. So I also want to take you all through the VCAT process and the general court system in Australia. And we'll have a review and be ready for our final exam, which is going to be a different type of exam, obviously, this time round. So I won't be able to share with you what we've done in the past. We can do that, but the exam this year is going to be quite different for obvious reasons. So what do you need to get a handle on in week 1? So you need to have a good understanding of what market value definition is. And the reason for that is because statutory valuations, in some instances, is a departure from fair market value. And I'll explain that as we proceed in the next few weeks. But you first need to understand what fair market value is. And this is the Australian Property Institute definition. And generally what it means is if the market value can be achieved when a property is put on the market and is advertised and marketed in the normal way that particular property is marketed in the general community. So a 3-bedroom brick veneer house in Malvern is marketed in a certain way. A industrial property in Werribee, for example, is marketed in a similar way. They're not the same. So we're talking about, generally speaking, how are those properties marketed? How are they put on the market for sale purposes? And so the definition of market value is those properties being advertised and marketed in a certain way. What is the end, and for a certain period, the standard period, the average period, and what would be the likely figure, amount of money that a purchaser and a vendor would come to an agreement on for that property to change hands. So that's broadly what the definition of market value is. Now, again, I emphasise you need to understand that, because we can make a comparison of what fair market value is to the way statutory valuations are undertaken. And there's a difference there, and you need to understand what the difference is and why it exists. So what I'd like you to do is really get into some reading in the next week or so. So you need to act pretty quickly. As I said, this is a pretty fast moving subject, so you need to understand the material we cover from week to week, because in the following week there'll be more difficult and just as complex principles that we'll cover. So this week I'd like you to look at the Valuation of Land Act 1960. It's not a lot of large act, so have a look through that. We're going to be covering a lot of legislation, and we're also going to be looking at some court cases. So again, a lot of reading in this subject. So 2 court cases we're going to be looking at pretty quickly. They're not court cases as such, because these 2 cases were heard at VCAT. So VCAT's a tribunal, not a court of law, but some useful guidelines come out of VCAT when there's a valuation dispute. So the 2 subjects, the 2 court cases I want you to look at reasonably quickly is 187 Settlement Road Proprietary Limited versus the City of Whittlesea, and AusNet Electricity Services Proprietary Limited versus the City of Whittlesea. So they're 2 really important court cases in assisting you to understand how rating valuations works in the state of Victoria. Also need you to give me an idea at some stage of what your knowledge of valuation principles. So to what extent have you been exposed to valuation processes here at the University of Melbourne? So maybe if you could give me an idea, because that'll give me an indication as to how much additional work I need to do in explaining some of the valuation principles, which you really should have a fair handle on in relation to moving forward on this subject. You're also going to need to have a pretty good Excel knowledge base. So for those who don't have a reasonable handle on Excel, you probably need to let me know if that's the case, because then we could spend a little more, I can spend a little more extra time with those students that haven't had a lot of exposure to Excel, because we'll be using the statistics functionality in Excel. I'm not sure if any of you have had the opportunity to do that, but Excel's got a pretty strong stats package, but you actually need to open it up. So multiple regression is something that will be used in this subject. So again, for those students who don't have a strong understanding of Excel, can you please let me know, because we might need to do a little bit of extra work with you, and I don't have an issue with that, so that's all good. Okay. And if you have a chance, have a look at a council rate notice, because there's a lot of information that you probably haven't had in the past a need or an interest in looking at, but start looking at a council rate notice and just have a general idea of what information is actually captured in that. So there's a link to the AusNet case that I want you to have a look at. Also in the slide, in the video of lecture 1, I spoke about you're going to find that rating and taxing valuations, which is what we're going to be covering in the first half of this subject, includes some weird processes, and you're going to ask yourself and ask me, why is that so? Why do we do things that way? And the main reason we do things the way we do in relation to raising property taxes is because there are many established principles that have been in place for thousands and thousands of years. So we use them today because they've been generally successful, because it's the system that we've got, certainly in Australia, and you can argue against this, but it's generally fair across the board. Now, there are going to be situations where you're going to find that the system isn't fair and unfairly targets different people in a way that you're going to say that system is not right because of how that particular person or company is treated. Now, I don't say that the system we've got in place is perfect, but as a general system across the board, it's the best system that we've been able to come up with over thousands and thousands of years. So it's important for you to understand why we do things in a certain way, which contradicts common sense in some cases. But when you look at the broader picture of governments raising property taxes, this is generally the fairest way to raise it. Sorry, did someone have a question? And I don't have a problem with anybody asking questions as we move along. Anybody?
I have a question, Gino. Efe
Yeah.
here. My question is regarding what are we going to be discussing in the tutorials moving forward? So are you expecting us to do the readings, watch the video, and then come here with questions?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So thanks for asking that. Yes, is the answer to those questions. I expect you to have already looked at the videos, already looked at the slides, looked at the reading material, and I know it's going to be difficult in a tutorial, certainly in this format, but I'm expecting us to for me to really not talk a lot other than answer your questions. Now, we have 70 students enrolled into this subject, so that's a large number to try and create an atmosphere where we can discuss various principles. So yes, it's going to be a challenge, but that's how I envisage the tutorial working. Now, if because of the numbers it's going to be difficult to do that, one way we'll get better at this as we go along, and more particularly I'll get better at this as we go along, but maybe the answer is to send me your questions via email, and then I can run through those questions and answer them in the tutorial. But I would like to have a bit more of an exchange between you guys and myself, and have a discussion on some of the principles. As I say, there's a lot of principles and practices and processes in this subject that you need to get a handle on. And the only way I see that is discussing and having an exchange of information and ideas and conversation about how they work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Just comparing to last semester's learning, there was the main issue was that the tutorial activities are a bit separate from the lecture content.
Right.
So you do one thing in lecture, and tutorial is a different application, a weird version of that.
Okay.
And because of that, in the past semester, I didn't get to ask and Q&A with any lecturer regarding the lecture material.
Yep.
I raised my concerns with Piyush, with the faculty, even sent an email to Vice Chancellor. And the conclusion, Chris is a corporate real estate management subject lecturer, and he said he's planning to break the 3-hour prescribed period to lower the number of people in each hour, to sort of create this 3 different tutorials to facilitate a bit more.
Yep. So I'm not sure why you haven't been given the opportunity to have a question and answer period, because I see that specifically as what a tutorial should do. You spend, and what I've been doing in the last 10 years here at Melbourne Uni is to have a 2-hour lecture and me basically talking, although I encourage questions during the lecture anyway. But then the third hour, the lecture, my material is well and truly covered by then, and I sit down and just give the students an opportunity to ask questions on the material that's been covered. Now, in the first lecture, it's always difficult because they haven't had time to really digest all the information. So I find in the past what we've been doing is the tutorials use basically for the material we covered the week prior. So because that's when the material is absorbed a little bit better, and the students have a better understanding and are more engaged in asking questions. But certainly I'll be looking to utilise this hour and longer if we need it for you to ask me questions on the material that you've been exposed to in the lecture. Any other questions? All right, so as I said, I covered the history of rating and taxing. So again, I will make sure you have access to the lecture slides as soon as I finish off tonight here. I don't understand why you don't have access to them. Maybe there's an access button that I've got to press for you to see them, but I will make sure that happens in the next hour or so. Not sure who's got their mic on. There's a little bit of feedback coming through, but that's all right. Okay, so this subject, as I said, is quite unique. I think it's in your own interests to make a real effort to understand the material, because I think, as I said in the lecture recordings, the theory, the practices, the principles that we cover here, generally people in the property profession struggle with them. Rates and taxes and how they're assessed, and compensation, compulsory acquisition and compensation, are things that property professionals try and, generally speaking, stay away from because they don't understand it. So if you make an effort to really understand the principles that I'll be covering in this subject, I think you're going to be ahead of most people in the property profession, because you'll be able to explain to your clients why council rates, why land tax in particular. You know, land tax with some clients costs millions of dollars annually. So if you can provide some advice to them whether something is not done correctly and save your client some money in relation to land tax, council rates, stamp duty, GST, capital gains, all that sort of stuff, I think it's going to make you have a more relevant product that you can offer your clients. So I included a couple of scenes from a very famous Australian movie called The Castle. So I'm not sure if you have had a chance to look at the movie, but if you haven't, do yourself a favour and have a look at the movie. Do you like that one? That's good. So it is quite a funny movie, but it does touch on the areas that we're going to be covering in this subject. So I could have put a link there to some of the scenes where a council valuer walks into the property and they have a discussion about what the council valuer's job is. And then there's a little bit of a scene in the court case where they're arguing over fair and reasonable compensation. So funny enough, this subject relates pretty strongly to some of the material in that movie. That's quite a funny movie. Okay. So the other bits that I want you to read up on this week is the Valuation of Land Act. Well, I've already mentioned the Valuation of Land Act. Have a closer look at the history and property taxes, but also Section 154 of the Local Government Act, which we'll be looking in detail next week, which covers the types of property that are rateable and types of property that are not rateable in the state of Victoria. So again, if you get a good handle on that, you'll be able to advise certain clients when they ask you for that information. And more importantly, make sure you have a look at Spencer versus Commonwealth. It's a very old court case, and that's where the market value definition came from. So make sure you cover that. Now, this might be a little bit unfair, giving you an assignment straight away. But again, we had to rehash a few things for this semester. So I thought one that would get you into the thinking mode of valuations is coming to grips with and explaining to me what highest and best use is. And I've given you a bit of a definition there. Dr. Murray, very famous valuation writer. But what I want you to do, and I don't want you to write a massive essay, we're only talking 500 words, is explain to me in your own words. So I don't want you to write textbook material, that's not going to work. You need to explain to me as if you were explaining to your parents what is highest and best use. And I want you to do that with giving an example of an actual property. Okay, so for those of you that are having a difficulty deciding or going to have difficulty in deciding which property, so look at a property that it's not, that can be further developed. So it's not developed to its highest level. So an easy example of that is a rural property, a farm that's been rezoned for residential development. That would be the most common. If you're looking to choose something in the inner city, suburban area, try something that's got an old house on it, on a large block, something that can be further developed. And that will assist you in explaining what the highest and best use principle is. And if you want, also talk about how it was derived. I think I've covered that in the material, in the history of rating and taxing. Again, why is that a principle that's held in high regard today? Because it's been in place for thousands and thousands of years. So again, to understand why we do things the way we do at the moment in this country, and in particular Victoria, it's based on the history. And as I said, not in all cases is it absolutely 100% fair, but the general system of raising rates and taxes that we have in place at the moment in Australia is the fairest system that we can come up with. And what I'll be looking for you in the next few weeks is to understand that system and to critique it. Be critical where do you think there are holes in it? Where do you think things can improve? Can you think of a better system that raises rates and taxes in a more fairer way? We've got, in what we're going through at the moment in Australia, or right across the world, we have governments throwing millions and billions of dollars at trying to fix this problem. Once we get over this pandemic, the next step is going to be the government's thinking of ways of raising the money to pay this debt back. And property is going to play a huge role in this, because property is the easiest way for governments to raise brand new and increase existing rates and taxes. And they're going to need that in the next few years. So again, property is really going to be important dynamic in doing that. So again, another reason for you all to really have a strong understanding of how the system of rating and taxing works in Australia. All right. So at this stage, assignment 1 is going to be due in a few weeks' time, but I totally understand because I haven't started this week. Fantastic, and you haven't got access to some of the material that we might tweak that. Okay, so I'm just reading through some of the chats that have been going on. So someone's already asked me a question about how do I mark each of the assignments. I'll put some of the criteria up online, but I don't know. I've had mixed comments about how I mark assignments, to extremely hard to not so hard. So I'm looking, generally speaking, as a general comment, I'm looking for you to show me that you've obtained a good understanding of the material that I've taught. That's basically in a nutshell. Now, there are 3 assignments. The first one, we've just spoken about highest and best use. So what I'm looking for you is evidence that you fully understand what the highest and best use principle is. So we're talking about how do I mark on that basis. It's difficult to say to you, this is what I'm looking for specifically. I'm looking for your words in your own writing. So I can tell straight away whether you've just quoted out of the reference books, and that's not going to work. So you need to explain to me in your own words what highest and best use is. And a good way to capture that is with an actual example of a property that displays those characteristics, a property that is used at the moment, not in its highest and best use, so it's underutilised. So you choose a property which, don't make it too difficult, but show me a property that connects with how you're explaining to me what highest and best use is.
Gino, excuse me.
Yep, any questions? Yep.
I was just wondering, in the context of selecting a property, are we to look at a property, for instance, under the highest and best use principles, the 4 of them, and select a property, or could we select a property that perhaps, I'm thinking like Docklands, that GFC strip of the Mirvac kind of peninsula where they drop down to like 3-story townhouses? Is that kind of
Perfect.
relevant?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good choice. Okay. Yep.
Okay.
That's good. For sure.
Thanks.
Okay, so just going through.
About the marking, do we not have a rubric for the subject?
I need to modify that slightly, but I will put that in place.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. So more questions on the exam. If you could all, I suppose the most important information I need from each of you right now, and I would gain this reasonably easy in a classroom because I would just ask you the question, but I need to gauge what your understanding of valuation principles is and what your knowledge and functionality of Excel is. They're things I need to know reasonably quickly. So if you have an opportunity to flip me an email with just a description along those 2 lines, that'll give me an idea of how much additional, because if you've all got a pretty strong knowledge of how to use Excel, then I don't have to do a lot of the introduction. We can jump straight into multiple regression reasonably quickly, but if some of you don't use Excel at an intermediate level, for instance, then I might need to spend a bit of time just going through some of the basics. So if you can give me some indication over the next few days, that would be great. Okay, so I've also got a question. We're jumping right into it. Will the exam be harder? That's a good question. So you're not going to be set up in an exam situation where you're going to be locked in a room for 3 hours answering 15 or so questions. So I don't know whether you find that easy or hard, so that depends on you. You say you're going to have flexibility in doing the exam in your own time and in your own space. I've never found it fair under exam situations to ask students to undertake a valuation exercise. So I've never required students to bring in calculators, for instance, and actually do a valuation in an exam, because that's just silly. You're putting students under pressure, and under that pressure they're going to generally make mistakes, especially if you're asking them to tap away on a calculator. Now, with the environment that we're in, I'll get that flexibility to actually throw a valuation exercise to you as part of a final exam. So I'm not sure whether that's harder or not. you can tell me maybe at the end of this semester whether that was. We can go through some of the past exam papers, but that's not going to help you for this particular this year's exam, because it's going to be quite different. Okay, let's see if I can. So still plenty of comments about not being able to find the lecture slide, so I'll certainly work on that tonight. Okay, so we've got a question here. Since you want us to use our own words, then are we expected to use any academic references for assignment 1? No. Well, okay. Modify that straight away. So I want you to read the academic references to understand. If you already got an understanding of highest and best use because you've covered that in previous subjects, then that's fine. If you don't need to then refer to academic references, highest and best use is generally a pretty straightforward principle. So then it's a matter of you just coming up with the words which shows me that you do have an understanding of what highest and best use is. And as I said, if you can explain, if you can attach a property, an actual example of that with those words, then I think that gives me a strong indication of where your level of understanding is at. Okay, so I've got another question about statistical packages in Excel. If you've got some spare time in the next week or two, then jump into Excel and have a look at some of the stats packages. So the problem's going to be, it might not make sense to you if you haven't had exposure to that, but what I might do in next week's lectures video recording is to show you how to open the stats package part of Excel and start playing around with that. So I might do that next week to give you some additional time in working. If you haven't had that experience in Excel, might give you a bit of extra time, but don't necessarily panic. I suppose panic a little bit if you haven't had a lot to do with Excel. No, don't have to panic, but let me know if you haven't really had a lot to do with Excel. So what does that mean? So can you do the basic things like sort, use VLOOKUP tables, obviously use the formulas, those sorts of things are what I would call straightforward and basic functions in Excel. If you haven't had a lot of exposure to those, then please let me know. And as I said, I don't have a problem with giving you some of those students some extra time, extra lessons on maybe how to use some of the basic functions in Excel, because the stats, the assignment 2 requires you to do some detailed data analysis. So as I said in the video, assignment 2 I will give you 5,000 properties, and I will give you a number of property attributes on all of those 5,000 properties. For example, the size of the land, the frontage of the land, how many metres frontage. I will give you the size of the house that's on the land, when the house was built, the number of rooms, total rooms, the number of bedrooms, the construction material of the house, whether it has a garage, the size of the garage, whether it has a carport, the size of the carport. So there's some basic data that I'll give you on the 5,000 properties. Of those 5,000 properties, there'll be probably somewhere between 5 and 10% of those properties would have sold in the period that I want you to value them. and so that's roughly, say, 500 properties. Analyse those 500 properties, delete the ones that are not helpful, and they'll become obvious. And then using Excel, I want you to do a multiple regression analysis on those 500, coming up with a model to value all of the 5,000 properties that I've given you. So that's the exercise. So high data analysis element to it. So someone's asked for VLOOKUP instructions. Yep, can do that reasonably easy, and I can actually show you how you can use VLOOKUP as a valuation tool as well. So I'll give you an example of that. That's no problems. So yeah, as I said, no need to panic right now about Excel. I just need to have an idea of what level of functionality you have with Excel, so I know where to start showing you how to use it. So is it from a basic level, which I don't have an issue with, or have you all used it pretty much in the last couple of years and you've got a pretty high understanding of how that works? And some of you might even have already used the statistical part of Excel. So as I said, if you can send me that information, that would be useful. Any other questions?
Yes, Gino, I got a question regarding the example of the assignment 1. So do you expect us to demonstrate the highest and best use of the example property from different aspects, like, in terms of the physical characteristics or the productivity, or from the legal basis?
Yep, absolutely. Good summary. Perfect. That's exactly what I want you to do.
Okay, so we just do it from different aspects, right?
Yep. So make sure, again, the choice is going to be choosing a property that clearly demonstrates that principle. So a property that is currently used in a basic manner, but somewhere where the legal and planning requirements allows much a higher density use of that particular property. Now, I don't want you to use this as a valuation exercise. I'm not wanting to test how you can value a property, more about your knowledge of how properties can be further developed. So I've also been asked a question, what do I mean by court precedent? So again, highest and best use is a principle that's established through court disputes. So use this opportunity to do some research as to which court cases in particular dealt with the highest and best use principle. And there are heaps of court cases. So pick one just to back up your view of what that principle actually means. So I've been asked the question, am I going to provide an assignment brief? Is that more in line, is that wanting more information than what I've already provided in relation to assignment 1? I can do that if you like. So the next, one of the questions also is, once we've found a property, what is the best way to look at for a court precedence that's applicable? So you don't need to connect the type of property that you've got with the court case. As I said, there'll be thousands and thousands of court cases with the highest and best use principle discussed in it. Just pick one. It doesn't have to relate to the type of property. It's more the principle that I'm looking for. So, all right, I'll provide some more information on assignment 1 as to what I'm expecting. So I might add that into the material that you've got as well. So that's okay. Don't have a problem with that. that's fine. Okay, so I've got a question now. Are there any specific differences of the statutory valuation from other general valuations for commercial use in valuation approaches, techniques and principles? Yes, absolutely. And we'll go into this in more detail in the next week or two, but to give you a specific example. So let's say there are two properties exactly the same. They're office properties. And they're identical. The person who developed this particular site constructed two buildings exactly the same. So let's say they're single-story office buildings, side by side, built exactly the same time, built the same size, and have the same number of car parking spaces out the front. So under the Spencer principle, those two properties would be valued exactly the same. Let's say if they were vacant, they would be valued exactly the same. In fact, even for statutory valuation purposes, for rating and taxing purposes, they'd also be valued the same. So let's take the case where they're now tenanted. Now, I'm in one of the buildings and I've got a valuation practice, and next door is an accountancy practice, and that's rented. And this property, that particular property, the tenant is paying $50,000 per annum. So, and it's a standard lease, 5 years with a 5-year option, and market reviews every year. Let's say market reviews every year. So that example, both under the Spencer definition and under the rating and taxing definitions that we'll cover, the valuations of those two properties, even though mine is owner-occupied, I own the property and I'm occupying it, so I'm not paying a rent, the valuation under, and let's keep this simple, so the market rent for both properties is $50,000 per annum, and the accountant next door is paying $50,000 per annum. Mine's owner-occupied, but the market value is $50,000. The capitalisation rates in the market for this type of property is 10%. So both properties have a value of $500,000. That's reasonably straightforward, yeah? All good? Okay. So that's a nice, easy example of when everything's nice and neat. So I'm getting old, and I've decided I don't want to keep my valuation practice going anymore. I want to retire. So I've got a colleague of mine that I've introduced into the firm for many, many years, and I want her to take over the business. So I'm selling her my business, which is fine, and I'm going to retain the ownership of the property because I want to use that as part of my superannuation fund. But to help her out, because she hasn't got a lot of money at the moment, I'm going to rent my office building to her at $25,000 per annum to help her out. So I'm intentionally renting it at 50%, and I'm giving her a long-term lease. I'm giving her a 10-year lease with a 10-year option. So let's revalue the properties now under those scenarios. So the accountant next door is still paying $50,000 per annum. $50,000 per annum is still the market rent. 10% is still the capitalisation rate. So the value of that particular property is $50,000. There's $500,000. Now, can anyone have a guess as to what my property is worth under the lease that I've just signed? Who wants to have a guess? Anyone? So, okay, no one's having a guess. I am renting my property at $25,000. The capitalisation rates is still 10%, give or take. Okay, someone's just had a guess at half, and that's absolutely correct. So let's say under those circumstances, my property is going to be worth roughly half. So instead of 500,000, it's going to be worth 250,000. Everyone understand that? The rent is half. So under the Spencer principle, if I sold my property and it's subject to a 25,000 per annum lease instead of 50,000, which is the market rent, someone's only going to pay roughly, depending on what estimates you make there, but let's keep it nice and simple and say that the capitalisation rates still stay the same at 10%. So someone will be prepared to pay 250,000. Now, was someone going to ask a question? I thought I heard someone. Okay, so under Spencer, my property. So the question I've got in front of me is, what about if it was vacant? So if it's vacant and there's no rent being paid, then it goes back to 500,000. So the 25,000 per annum is an encumbrance and is affecting the value of the property, so it drags it down. So someone who buys that property will only receive 25,000 per annum for the next 20 years. So they're not going to pay you 500,000, only going to pay you part. Yeah, so if someone's asked the question, if it was only 3 years, then would that have a difference? Absolutely. So the value would be somewhere between 250 to 500,000. So the main difference that I'm trying to get across to you in relation to the Spencer definition and the definition of rating and taxing valuation. So when the rating and taxing valuer comes out to do that valuation, so under Spencer, my property is worth 250, next door is worth 500,000. But for rating and taxing purposes, both properties will pay rates and taxes on the 500,000. So why is that the case? So that's a major difference from Spencer's value and the rating and taxing value. And the reason why the rating and taxing value stays at 500,000 is because the legislation, will go into this in a lot more detail in the next couple of weeks, but I want you to come to grips with what the main difference is because existing leases that are an encumbrance that detrimentally affect the value of the property are to be disregarded in a rating and taxing scenario. So I come along and do a rating and taxing valuations on both those properties. I look at the accountant, see he's paying 50,000 per annum. I determine that's the market rent. I apply that market rent on both properties, not the 25,000 onto the other property. So the market rent is 50,000. The capitalisation rate is 10%. So I value both of those properties for rating purposes at 500,000. So you can understand the confusion that exists out in the property profession when someone gets a bank valuation of a property at 250,000, and that's fair and reasonable, that's under Spencer. But when the council rate notice comes out, that property has a value of 500,000. Vast difference. And people get confused about that. They don't understand it. So it's important for you all to understand the major difference between Spencer and the definitions in rating and taxing valuations. So just sit with that for a few days. As I said, have a look at the definitions in the Valuation of Land Act and make sure you get a handle on what the Spencer definition is about. And then I can explain to you why those differences, how those differences are meant to be taken into account, why they exist, and how to go about explaining that to potential clients, to some of your clients. Any other questions? The other thing I'd like to hear from everyone is if you want to keep this tutorial at this same time, I'm okay with it. But if I know we've all got flexibility now that we're all at home, so if you'd like to change the time of this, please let me know. Send me emails to either my University of Melbourne email address or my work email address. I'm fine with either one, and then I can make a decision, an informed decision as to whether to move or keep it at this time moving forward. Okay, so I'm getting some comments there that 7 p.m. is still good. I'm happy with that. Just want to make sure that that's still the case with everybody. Okay, so question. I was reading something last night where they said that the HBU analysis and the value would consider the cost equity capital of the purchase in some cases. Is that true? Oh, look, there's going to be a lot of debate moving forward as to what method of valuation in the future is going to be best way to go. We could devote a whole subject to that one just in itself, but if you've got any specific questions in relation to that, please let me know. But for ones, you're going to have enough principles and practices to cope with that I've got already prepared for you, without going on to the debates that are happening at the moment in the open marketplace as to how the valuation approaches are going to differ moving forward. All right, so let me know. I've got some comments there that moving it to 5 might be better. So I'll go with the majority. Let me know what your thoughts are and we'll make a decision on how to move forward. All right, any questions before we leave off? I will endeavour to have the lecture slides and the reading and the subject reader available for you tonight somewhere, and I'll send you an announcement. Even if I have to take the basic approach of emailing it to you all, I'll do that. It's a property for the sale, expecting it to pick a specific property around the neighbourhood or just a general example. No, I want you to pick up a specific property. I mean, with Google now, you can pick up a lot of properties, but I want you to pick up an actual address of a property, not a theoretical one. So tell me of a particular property, how it's being used right at the moment, and what does the zoning allow for development potential. Does this mean if an agricultural land gets rezoned to residential use, the land will face a surge on rates and taxes? Absolutely. And that's maybe one of the severe disadvantages of the current system. And that's why I want you to understand highest and best use. So I will give you examples of a little old lady who owns a property in the middle of Paran, and she's been there for 60, 70 years. She bought the property with her husband when they got married. He's passed away. She lives there on her own, and she's on a pension, but the property is worth multi-million dollars because it has this development potential and its location. So yes, one of the terrible disadvantages with the current rating and taxing system is that the system almost makes it difficult for her to stay in her property, because the annual rates and taxes just makes it difficult for her to pay them, and she just keeps going in debt because of the current system. So we know that that's a clear disadvantage in the system, but what I'll be doing is showing you the whole system and how it generally works. But again, I'm looking for you to give me your opinions as to where you think the holes are and where improvements can be made. Okay, any questions before we go? I know it's been a bit of a rocky start. It's not ideal, but I'll make sure I rectify that as soon as I can. Okay, so we've got another question. In practice, how the government is able to ensure the statutory valuation results are maximally accepted by owners, since the number of valuations is so disputable and even quite different from different values. The government will employ several values and choose the best. So it's not about choosing the highest value. I mean, and we'll go into this in a bit more detail in next week's class. One of the strong advantages of the rating and taxing system is that there are clear principles that established principles that the governments have to follow, but also it gives rights to owners and tenants to dispute the level of rates and taxes that are assessed on their property. So we've got a very robust system, and yes, there are a high number of disputes, and I think moving into this pandemic period that the number of disputes is going to increase, but the system is there for that to happen, for property owners to challenge how much they're rated on and taxed on. So I think that is a good system, protects the rights of owners and tenants, and clearly puts into place the principles that the governments have to follow when they do rating and taxing valuations. Okay, any other questions before we sign off? We all good? All right, so have a start on assignment 1. Work on the basis that you're going to have to hand that in on the due date, but if we struggle getting all the material out, then I might extend that. Not that extending it's going to help you anyway, because all that does is push you everything further down the track, which doesn't necessarily work well. Anyway, let me look at that and see what I can do. All right, thanks for bearing with me this week. I'm sure we'll all get better, and we'll see you all next week. And please, so someone's asked me when will lectures. I'll make an attempt to release them on the weekend so that you've got plenty of time to look at them. So that's the target date. All right, all the best, and we'll talk soon. Please don't hesitate to email me with any questions or any issues, and in particular, the level that you're at with Excel, and also that general valuation principles. All the best. Night.
Thank you.
Thank you.